Hi, welcome to Chapter 2 for Criminal Justice Ethics 310. So we'll get started. I'll be referring to Chapter 2 PowerPoints. Let's start with the three things that shape policing, styles of policing, which is kind of sometimes an individual choice or sometimes chosen like focus areas and stuff like that. Also, policing as an institution, which, usually an institutional culture shapes how the police officers, and lastly, police culture. A lot of times you'll see police policies and regulations, but they'll be completely inconsistent with what's acceptable. For instance, I'll refer to the Lake Charles Police Department. It's a local police department here, and in their policies it states, "Thou shalt be courteous and professional," and so forth and so on. But their culture, when they show up to, at least this is January of 2023, I just recently reviewed a video involving them in a traffic stop, and they're not supposed to use profanity and so forth. But while watching the video, the dash cam video of this one instance, I heard the F word. Well, I guess I can say it's my class, but I heard the word fuck at least 25 times throughout this interaction. So while their policies say that that's not acceptable, their culture is to just show up, and that's consistent with many of the other videos that I watch. So anyway, there can be a difference between the institutional rules versus what's actually carried out on the street. And in the investigations of complaints and so forth, I basically don't see any reference to those actions, or it's like they're not even investigated. It's just almost ignored, like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be talking this way, or maybe this part should be addressed. It's just not like it's ignored. So it's an acceptable part of the culture, which I believe is unprofessional, but that's part of the culture. And again, I say again, not all officers speak to people that way. Many of them are professional, but when it gets to me, it's usually a contested issue. So that's just an example. Police culture. There has been a culture in policing that's starting to change since George Floyd and national outrage over the videotaped homicide of an officer who thought he could just do it with impunity and wasn't afraid that he was on video and actually killed a man, and I guess was surprised when now he's going to most likely spend the rest of his life in prison for that. But there's a concept of don't hesitate to use deadly force. And I give this speech in my police academy classes. Every time I say, there's this mentality, there's some law enforcement trainers out there who come in and say, the main objective that we're training you for is to go home at the end of your shift. That's your number one priority. And so I'll ask, how many of you have been taught or believe that your number one goal is to go home at the end of your shift? And I'll get about 20, sometimes 75%, sometimes half, but usually better than half of the class will say, yes, my number one goal is to go home at the end of your shift. And then I go into my next part of that speech and I say, it's time for you to get out of law enforcement. You are in the wrong line of work. There's a lot of jobs out there where if your goal is to go home at the end of your shift, that it's much more statistically probable that that's going to happen. Don't get into construction. Don't get into, there's a lot of dangerous jobs out there, truck driving, stuff like that. But definitely don't get into police work, because it can be a dangerous job, and there's a chance that you won't go home at the end of your shift. You're going to be driving fast. You're going to be showing up to stuff where people are running away from. So if that is your goal, and then I ask them, okay, how many of you, if you hear shots fired at a local school, are going to grab your gun and get in your car and go to that school as fast as you can and run towards it and try to kill who's ever killing these children? And they all 100% raised their hand. I said, and does that sound like somebody who their number one priority is to go home at the end of their shift? And it doesn't. So again, if that's the job of a police officer, to go home at the end of their shift, then you're in the wrong line of work. Now that I think the facts are out on Uvalde, Texas, they sat outside while a man executed children, and they were bleeding to death and dying, and they were calling 911 and begging, say, please help us, please save us. And you've even got a state trooper outside the building on video saying, hey, is your kids in there? And the state trooper, and they're not going in. They're just allowing them to die. And the state trooper said, no, if my kid was in there, I'd already be in there. And that's, you know, if your mentality is my job is to go home at the end of my shift, that means I'm not going to go to that shooting. I'm not going to respond properly to that shooting, which they were all trained to do. Active shooter. It's very simple. Somebody's killing people. You go in and kill them until they stop. If you go in and that person's got a big gun and he throws bullets at you, that's better than them throwing them at children. You made this choice already to be a police officer and to be willing to put yourself in harm's way. That if you didn't, if you're not going to do that when the time comes, you are a coward, and get out of my profession. And that's what happened in Uvalde, Texas. That's why more children died than they had to. And that's why a lot of people are looking much, as they should be, at law enforcement on how they do that. I can say with certainty that in Southwest Louisiana, that our officers will go towards the threat. Lake Charles PD, Calcasieu Sheriff's Office, State Police, the Marshal's Office, McNeese PD, our federal agencies are going to go, and they're not going to wait while children die. So anyway, that's part of, we'll say, culture and the sometimes lack of hesitation in using deadly force. Now, yeah, I kind of get off on tangents sometimes, but there is some hesitation now because a lot of law enforcement officers who have used deadly force, even when it's not justified, they've gotten away with it for many years. But now it's kind of starting to switch where law enforcement officers are being held accountable, at least more often. And I've even seen some cases where law enforcement officers they're trying to hold them accountable when they didn't do anything wrong. They acted within their training. So that's another issue that's making some law enforcement officers a little bit more hesitant to use deadly force. And I am afraid, and I believe it is happening, that hesitation might be too much. We need to find the right balance. But the concept of shoot first and ask questions later, that I don't think that's ever. I think that the public has that concept that thinks that law enforcement acts that way, but usually not. I think training can be an issue, but with that said, there is sometimes law enforcement officers out there who want and seek to use deadly force, and I've seen those personally. But for the most part, law enforcement officers don't want to put hot lead on human flesh. It's violent, it's combat, and these are not combat soldiers. I'm not even going to pretend like they are. These are civilians who have been put in a position where they're supposed to be professional and courteous all the time, and then out of the blue, without expectation, they're put into a small window of a war zone that they can only prepare for and hope never happens, but it might happen. And when I say compare it to a war zone, you're getting shot at, usually for just a few seconds and it's over. Whereas you go to combat and you might be expecting it. You live under the stress of it all the time. There are huge differences, but we train law enforcement officers to be not soldiers, but law enforcement officers for civilian population. But again, we have to train them to be ready for something, just in case something happens. A part of police culture that is out there is cynicism, and police are victims. Like, nothing we can do is going to change anything. Police are victimized by the public, and that's just a culture that some police adapt to, and that force is available, and sometimes the resorting to force is necessary, but it can happen too quickly, and sometimes it doesn't happen quickly enough. Something that the police do have is, I call it the most effective tool on the gun belt, or I said the utility belt. The police always have a gun, taser, baton, etc., but they also have, their most powerful tool is discretion, the decisions that they are allowed to make in the performance of their duty, who to arrest, who to write a ticket to, whether they, the arrest or not arrest, the investigation of crimes to assist victims and so forth. That is a lot of power. You stop somebody for impaired driving. We don't. That could ruin somebody's career. They're a truck driver. They'll never be a truck driver again. They pay a lot of fines, suffer disrepute in the community, so forth. And there are times if that person's politically connected, they won't be arrested. And I've suffered from that myself, as in I would stop politically connected people and knowing that if I arrested them, it would actually be harmful towards me. And that's just the real world of it. We talked about ethics training in chapter 1, but I'll just go over it just a little bit more again. Ethics training typically focuses on what you can get away with, kind of like the law. Like if you do this, you'll get arrested, but you can do anything outside of that, you won't get arrested. You can accept a meal as long as it's 1 penny at or below that what's acceptable. So again, ethics training is lacking a moral component. It started in Ferguson, Missouri, but the attention started coming in Ferguson, Missouri when there were protests and so forth. And the response to protests in Ferguson, Missouri after the shooting of Michael Brown, they responded militarily. Military vehicles, water cannons, spray, combat gear, or at least tactical gear, riot gear in response. And so a lot of people are having a problem with the militarization of police, because using military assets to police a civilian population can look like more like a less democratic society where you're under the control of the government excessively and you don't have any more constitutional rights. So, but the military used to sell their equipment arbitrarily, with impunity to civilian law enforcement agencies. So you had law enforcement agencies getting armored vehicles, which have a great use under the right circumstances. For instance, the Calcasieu Sheriff's Office has armored vehicles that they can go in and rescue people and so forth and bring people out without getting shot and protect the person. If somebody's down, they can block bullets and pick somebody up by ambulance, that where an ambulance couldn't do that. They also have military vehicles that are also serve as high water vehicles, so especially when we had floods and stuff like that. So I think the moral use of our military equipment locally is excellent. But there was I forgot where it was, maybe in California or somewhere, they were getting rid of AR-15s or M16s. And the M16 is a great weapons platform for when you have someone, an active shooter or a suspect with a rifle or whatever. It's a good tool for law enforcement to have. The sidearm is a defensive weapon, so that's great. But they were also getting rid of bayonets. This is a long knife attached to the front of a rifle for when you run out of ammunition, you affix your bayonet and you attack the target and stab them to death. That was probably a little too much, and I think they did put a stop to that. But we'll say has been a militarization of police. There's a lot more SWAT teams out there. I was a state police SWAT operator and a state police SWAT instructor, explosive breacher. So that was one of my jobs. And but SWAT is a we'll call it a hammer, and not every job is a nail. So, but there's that militarization of the police kind of falls in line with the consistently that it's an us versus them mentality. And some people see that as threatening, and rightfully so. There's the right balance. I've covered the increase in the use of SWAT teams, so that will probably be on some of your tests. Talk a little bit about corruption and police corruption. You got kickbacks. I do something for you, you do something for me. That's simple. Opportunistic theft. And I'm on slide 13 in chapter 2 if you want to look at this. Opportunistic theft. That's where you're at a burglary scene and we'll say a bunch of money. The burglar dropped a bunch of money. You pick it up and take it with you. There was an instance where I was called to a scene on the Interstate 10 near Ioway, Louisiana, between Lake Charles and Ioway, Louisiana, and there was a drug dealer had taped money underneath the car and didn't account for Louisiana roads, and it fell out from underneath the car, and it was 2 miles of cash, and it was probably started out at $500,000 or more. But we ended up picking up around $66,000. It would have been very easy to just take some of that money and put it in my pocket, or at least pay for lunch or whatever. But I'll tell you today, it was outside the statute of limitations. So I could tell you I took some of that money and not get in trouble. But with that said, I did not take a penny of it. But it would have been an easy opportunity. I can't speak for the rest of the troopers that were there. I don't think they took any. But that's just an example of the ability for an opportunistic theft. Shakedowns, finding illegal behavior and saying, hey, you can continue to operate, but you're going to pay me some. That's kind of similar to kickbacks and protection of illegal activities. The traffic fix, we call it, or we call it fixing traffic citations. I can't tell you how many times as a trooper I got a call and says, hey, you just wrote such and such a ticket. That's a friend of mine. His wife is a cop. She knows the judge, blah, blah, blah. You either say no and get a reputation, or you just fix the ticket. So, we had something called ticket accountability. And so each ticket was numbered and it went into a system. And so you couldn't just throw it away. So I thought you couldn't just throw it away, because they would say, hey, where's this ticket that you had 6 months ago? It's never been turned in. And now you're 500 tickets past that. And so what you would do is we would line out the speeding and then just change it to a seatbelt ticket. And I kind of got tired of doing that. So I said, well, I wonder what would happen if I just didn't turn a ticket in. So I took, just to see what would happen, I took a blank ticket that I never wrote to anybody, and I just threw it away just to see what would happen. And anyway, 6 months, a year goes by, no call, no nothing. So I figured at that point that they never followed up on a missing citation. And I would find citations that had been lost in a drawer for a year. And, so anyway, from after that, when somebody said, hey, would you fix this ticket? And I'll be like, yeah, I got it. And they say, oh, you're going to change it to a seatbelt. I say, no, I'm just going to throw it away. I was like, you can do that? And I was like, I did. So anyway, I can tell you that, because if it is illegal, the statute of limitations has expired and I'm okay. But that's it. And then you got the misdemeanor fix, felony fix. That's basically how you investigate a crime. An officer is I'm not going to say almost, an officer is actually never required to make an arrest. Now, the law says under some circumstances they're supposed to arrest a domestic violence suspect. With that said, the officer still determines if there's probable cause to arrest that suspect. So if he deems at that time that there's no PC, doesn't have to make an arrest, doesn't have to investigate it, can find out and work it where they don't get investigated. I've had cases like that where I would arrest people for felony evasion, and they were connected in some way, as in felony running from the police, and they would know somebody, and my supervisor would get a call, and they'd be let go with nothing. So, that happens. Direct criminal activities, obviously, beating people, which the Louisiana State Police, my former agency, is deservingly getting prosecuted. They murdered a man named Ronald Green in Louisiana, and had it on video and covered it up and said that he died in a car crash until the video gets released, and now everybody knows about it. It's just a major embarrassment to the organization. That's just direct criminal activities. That's easy. Internal payoffs, like a common one for there is there's an overtime detail available or something that pays well, and the person in charge of giving that out will say, hey, I'll give you this if you'll give me some of the money or whatever. That's just an example of an internal payoff. And lastly, corruption of authority, using your authority to get stuff, showing up for court on a custody hearing, wearing your badge and your gun, stuff like that I've seen happen. When it comes to direct criminal activities, I think people overlooked or people don't pay enough attention to, it's the theft of time. Government employees steal time. They're paid by the hour, and that's the thing that's most stolen, taken by the government is called payroll fraud. So for instance, we had several Louisiana State troopers throughout the state that would say that they were working, but they were not working, and receive payment for that, and while they were at home or working another job or whatever on their off day. So that's just an example of that, and there were several arrests for that. All right, we've talked about gratuities in the last lesson. Some people say it's acceptable, some people say it's not. I do teach that it is not acceptable, because you're creating at least an informal contract with that person. And I do speak as a hypocrite. When I became a trooper, I was told this is where you go to get the discounts, and I followed my training officers and my supervisors to these different restaurants, and they said, hey, this is what we do. It's perfectly acceptable, and I did it for several years while I was on patrol. And then later I decided, after, we'll say, studying it myself and developing my own moral compass outside of what the agency culture was, that it's not acceptable. But I say that as a hypocrite, because, starting out, you're not making a lot of money. And I don't judge anybody for, we'll say, accepting them today, because there's a lot of good people out there. They just want to help law enforcement. And I actually own a business now, and I give discounts to law enforcement. So, and they're well accepted. So, and I would hope that if they caught me speeding or whatever, that they might not write me a ticket. So I'm just as unethical as the rest of them, just so you're aware. All right, let's talk about noble cause corruption. So noble cause is doing something bad, but with a good cause. Like back to the beating of a suspect. If you beat a suspect to get a good outcome, as in get a major case, a missing child or whatever. And I was watching a TV show the other day called The Shield, back from the early 2000s, and that's Detective Vic Mackey. That's one of the things that he did. Nobody would beat the guy, but Vic would. So they called him in and said, hey, he's got a girl, and he beat him until he got a confession, found the girl, and she would have died otherwise. So I know, of course, that's the media, but that's what we call noble cause corruption. You know, like, let's say you get somebody who raped and or even murdered a young child. There's a gentleman, that's very generous of me. There's a guy in California who went in through an unlocked door window of a home and murdered a 9-year-old girl, stabbed her to death. He left, and the police came and investigated it, and immediately focused their investigation on it, her 14-year-old brother, whom they had no physical evidence whatsoever. And they charged the brother after a tortured confession. And finally, DNA evidence came back that actually showed them who the real killer was. But because the police focused so much effort on the 14-year-old brother and tortured a confession out of him, they weren't able to effectively prosecute the person who really committed the crime. So there is currently today a murderer walking around that killed a 9-year-old girl. He went to prison for other crimes, but he got out, and now he walks the streets today. So I have a problem with that. So if a police officer were to come in and arrest that guy and plant a pound of methamphetamine on him, is that police officer really a bad person? And I could honestly look that police officer in the face and say, I don't think you're a bad person. And if he got caught, and I was on the jury, I would not give him a conviction, and I would not award any civil damages, because his cause was so noble to punish, and what I'm saying is wrong. But I have a heart and I have emotions, and sometimes I think and act on those versus what the law says. So the formalist would say, oh no, you can't plant evidence on anybody. And you're right, that'd be completely unethical when it comes to formalism. But if you put away a man who actually murdered a child, then is that outcome good? And I think it is. The way to get there is bad. So, and the girl's name that was murdered, if you want to Google it, her name is Stephanie Crow. And like I said, her killer still walks around to this day in California. So let's see. I think we can, combating corruption in policing, starting with recruitment. There are police officers. In fact, I think there was one recently hired, and the police psychologist looked at this officer and said, do not hire this person. He is dangerous. Has major psychological issues, but the department hired him anyway, and lo and behold, what did he do? He screwed up. So the recruitment is an issue. We need to be recruiting good officers with good psychological backgrounds, and we need to pay them properly too, because it's hard to get an officer to come and do such a hard job for such low pay. And the ones that are willing to do it at such a low pay, there could be a problem there. So anyway, recruiting, reducing the opportunities for corruption, that comes to supervision. So if you, and I was taught when I came in to steal time as a trooper. I was taught, do this, write 20 tickets. You can do that in 2 hours, 3 hours, and then just spend the rest of the day doing whatever you want. Go home, go to sleep, go to the gym, go eat lunch. Don't work. I was taught that from day one, and that is a felony. So, the opportunity for corruption was not only there, the opportunity for corruption was, and by the way, I didn't do that. I was taught to do it, but I didn't do it. The opportunity for corruption is there because the supervisors not only said it was okay, but they actually demonstrated it, the felony. They committed the felony and said, do what I did. And so obviously supervision can reduce the opportunity for corruption. Once it's detected, actually respond to it, and deter it. There's ways to do that, video reviews, when somebody uses force. Watch the video. Chicago had a big problem before where they were not reviewing videos on use of force. An officer would say, oh, he came at me with a knife, and so I shot him 6 times. Well, the rounds were in his back, and the video showed you shot him not after he ran at you with a knife, but after he was just running away. And so if they would have just looked at the video or had some level of detecting and deterring it, maybe it would have been a different outcome. That particular Chicago officer was cleared by Internal Affairs, stayed on patrol for a year until the video was released in a court battle, and then eventually he ended up getting arrested. But I don't think he was even fired from the department, or at least not even removed from patrol at that point. And lastly, reinforcing the motivation to act morally. Reward officers who come forward with misconduct, catch an officer doing the right thing the right way and reward that, but definitely not rewarding unethical behavior. And I've seen that a lot, unethical behavior getting rewarded. So whistleblowers. So being in law enforcement, it's called being a rat. And I don't like that connotation, because I think if you're a law enforcement officer and you report a fellow officer for misconduct, and I'm talking about real misconduct, if an officer who, let's say, is in a fist fight with somebody and is getting attacked, and then they go to the ground and there's punches being thrown, and you would have punched the guy 5 times, but you see the officer actually punch him 6 times. Okay, well, that's not reportable. It's just a small judgment call. But I'm talking, when you see, for instance, I reported internally dereliction of duty when I was still a state trooper, dereliction of duty to supervision, and I was severely admonished by my fellow officers for doing it, and I thought it needed to happen. And I think I'll tell you about that later in the course, but I had a situation where a child molester was let go or got away because the officer wouldn't do his job. And I reported that, and the person I reported it to was actually committing felony payroll fraud on a daily basis. And so it was kind of hard for him to actually do anything to anybody else when he was guilty of so much himself. So, they obviously didn't do anything. And then when whistleblowers step up, and I've seen it many, many times, I'm seeing lawsuits right now where the whistleblower steps up and they face worse treatment, or even, I guess it's a good time to start talking about him now. There's a trooper in Louisiana. He was terminated. His name's Carl Cavalier. Ronald Green was beaten to death on video, and the troopers who did it got away with it. They weren't even investigated. They just like, oh, he died in a car crash, but everybody knew, everybody in the supervision knew what happened. Well, Carl Cavalier reported it. They told him to mind his own business, and they did nothing about it. They told him, he's finally decided to get some real attention to it. So he went to the media as a state trooper. That is a policy violation. It is not allowed. And you can be subject to punishment for a policy violation. Well, once he went to the media started getting involved in it. They finally get the real video and tell what happened and just expose his corruption. And they finally tell the trooper that beat the man to death that he was going to be terminated. This is years after he actually did it. And that evening, that trooper killed himself. And Carl Cavalier was actually terminated for reporting it. And now, but he tried reporting it internally, nothing happened. So Carl became a whistleblower. And in my mind, Carl is a hero. He's my Rosa Parks, I call him. And I've talked to him personally. Rosa Parks sat on the wrong part of the bus, and that was illegal. But she said, I'm not going to follow your law because your law is wrong. And in this case, the policy is wrong, and they terminate him for it. He has no job, and they're involved in civil litigation right now. And if you ever have a chance to look up Carl Cavalier and show him some support, I might even participate in some protests as they come up. But Carl Cavalier is a hero trooper who stepped up and did the right thing. And currently, as far as I know, was the only and the most disciplined person in that whole murder situation. He didn't commit the murder, he just exposed it. But he was the one who was punished before and more severely than anybody else. So, all right. So last I'm gonna talk about this chapter is the concept of racial profiling. So a lot of people say police aren't racist. Well, I'm a white male cop from the South. People talk. And I am a fly on the wall. And they don't hold back until they find out who I am at my core. And I've listened to that a lot of my career. law enforcement is. Many law enforcement officers are racist. I'm not talking about they just might, look at a guy and think, oh, he's black, so he might be. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about that, and I'm talking about that N-word, period. The N-word, like it's nothing. I had fellow troopers. We talked about criminal patrols. Their job is to go out and find people driving, transporting drugs across the state. And I was like, well, how do you do it? So we got these portable radios, not the ones that are recorded from the police, but from Walmart. They keep up their portable radios and they say, hey, there's a racial slur headed towards you in this lane or whatever, driving this car, go stop them. And they find a reason to stop minorities with out-of-state plates. And that was their job. That was their profile, which is, by the way, illegal as hell. And then they go stop them and may find something, may not. But I'm like, well, how do you get away with that? Especially when, there's times when you have to document the race of everybody you stop. So then they would go into, oh, well, I balance out the stops with white stops at the end of the shift. And they'll basically go out and stop white people, like the last hour or two of the shift, stop and say, hey, you're following too close, have a nice day. And then that's a white stop. And then just keep logging their 5 or 6 white stops to balance out their stats. These are their words, not mine. This is what they were attempting to train me to do. We had a black trooper come in, and this is at Lake Charles, Louisiana State Police Troop D. Some of the people I am referring to are still Louisiana State Troopers. But we had a black trooper come in, and he didn't dress the way that they thought he should dress, as in he dressed, in their terms, black. He wore jeans that were not skin-tight Wranglers, which I actually find skin-tight Wranglers more offensive than anything else. They were loose-fitting jeans, and he had a large shirt, and he had a nice gold chain. I'll say a good-looking young black guy. They said because the way he dressed when he was off duty, and like I said, there was nothing wrong with the way he dressed. That was my opinion anyway. They said that he failed to meet the standard to be a Louisiana State Trooper. So the word was, when my supervisor came out of the office with the captain at the time, he said, the captain said, run that N-word off. Because the standard, that was his exact words. And I don't think I'll give his name. I won't give his name right now, but he's still there. And anyway, I'm not going to give his name. That trooper is still there, though. And I went and told that trooper what had happened. But the standard, and it was explained to me when I first got there, it's like, hey, this trooper is okay because he meets the standard. I was like, what's the standard? It's like, oh, you got to act white. So act white, you can be a good black trooper. Don't act white, and you can't. They'll do everything they can to run you off. I did tell that trooper what was happening, and he was continually subjected to racial discrimination, but he's still there. He's a successful trooper, a good man, and a good trooper. And I won't say his name either, but anyway, yeah, I will. His name's Trooper Chris Hill. He's a good cop, good trooper. So, but he's, that's the reality. And people say, well, cops aren't out there stopping people because they're black, and some officers actually are. And some officers are racist. Driving while black, that was some research done on the New Jersey Turnpike about who was stopped, who was ticketed, who was searched, and the statistics do show that overall there is a racial discrimination involving police work. So that wraps up chapter 2. We'll see you in chapter 3.